Good morning, brothers and sisters, online and on-site. So today we are on the chapter 10 of First Chronicles. Chapter 1 to chapter 9 are about the genealogies. So from chapter 1 to chapter 8 is talking about the genealogies from Adam to Israelites. And chapter 9 talks about those people who live in Jerusalem. So whoever was willing to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city there, they will be remembered by the Lord. Especially the high priests, the Levites, and the Nethinim, as well as the 4 tribes. And then we go into chapter 10. We come to chapter 10. But in this chapter, it only talks about the tragic end of King Saul. Actually, we could have talked a lot about the different issues of King Saul. For example, how did he come to know David, and how could he become the king? So there were quite a lot of issues about King Saul. But in First Chronicles, in this chapter, it only talks about his tragic end. It's only talks about tragic ends of King Saul. And because why his intention is for us to pay attention to the tragic end of Saul. So chapter 10 of First Chronicle is more or less the same with 1 Samuel chapter 31. There might be a slight adjustment. Shall I put in this way, the author might have changed it a little bit. Well, overall it's the same, but he made a slight adjustment. So he added on 2 more verses. And these 2 more verses are the message that he wanted to deliver. So the topic of today is be careful, do not rebel against God. King Saul was chosen by God. King Saul got a calling from the Lord. That was to rescue the Israelites from the hands of the Philistines. So because of this calling, so basically he won all the battles throughout his lives. He only lost 1 battle. That was the very last battles. So why would he end up in the tragic end? So this is the topic of today. Be careful. Don't rebel against God. Be careful. Don't rebel against God. So King Saul rebelled against God. So that's why he ended up in the tragic end, even though he was chosen by the Lord. Even though he was called and anointed by the Lord. But yet when he rebelled against God, his end would become tragic. So the author would like to make full use of this chapter to warn the Israelites at that time. So of course it is good that you respond to God's calling and to go back to Jerusalem. But yet we still need to move on and keep following God until the very end. Once we rebel against God, then we will end up in the tragic end. So verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the men of Israel fled from before the Philistines. So for this part, actually, it is the same with 1 Samuel chapter 31. But let me tell you some difference in verse 4. So when King Saul was hurt by the sword, was hurt by the arrows, and so that's why King Saul said to his armor bearers, draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised men come and abuse me. Verse 4. But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. Therefore Saul took a sword and fell on it. So the author would like to tell us, so what's the last words of King Saul? So what he means is, come on, just kill me, because I don't want to be humiliated. So as a king, it was his very last words. But yet the armor bearers would not, because he was greatly afraid. So it means by the end of his life, his very closest assistants did not want to listen to him. So, by the end of his life, he still treasured a lot of his face value. So right at the start, when Samuel rebuked King Saul, and King Saul tried to tear the clothes of tear the clothes of Samuel. So it means that actually King Saul did not repent at all. What King Saul intended to do was, Samuel, could you please go with me to worship God together in front of all my people? Why did he want to persecute David? Because all the people say that, David, King Saul killed thousands of people, but David killed 10,000. So Samuel's glory was higher than King Saul. Samuel rebuked King Saul. So that's why, right in front of all his people, he told Samuel that, Samuel, could you please go with me to worship God in front of my people? So this is the concept of the overall message. So it means that even he was about to die, he still treasured a lot of his face value, because he didn't want to lose his dignity in front of his people. So, and then in verse 5, we are told that he killed himself. He fell on his sword and died. How would a leader being chosen by the Lord would kill himself? Did he do it on impulse? No, not at all. So the first thing, the root problem was he treasured a lot of his face value. So he knew that he was losing the battle, and he didn't want to lose his face. And also before at the end of the battle, he had done something. If you still remember that there was a battle, during the battle, he issued an order saying that whoever partook any food, then I will kill him, I will punish him. And then he said, if I did not do so, then God's punishment will be upon him. And then finally it turns out that his own son, Jonathan, did take the food. So that's why he would like to kill his son. But his people tried to stop him. So that's why he stopped killing his son. But it's simply because he didn't want to lose his face in front of his people. Because upon the request of his people, he could not kill his son. Because that's what he said at the start, right? He said that if I did not do it, and then God's punishment would be upon him. So do you see that actually he died upon his own words? And he did issued an order to the whole nation that whoever consulted medium would be killed. This is what he said before. But finally, he also consulted the medium, and that's why finally he was killed and he died. So you can put it this way, he died because of what he said. Well, just like what he said before, he proclaimed God's judgment to be upon those people who did not comply with what he said. So out of the just for the sake of not losing his face value, he made all these decisions. So that is nothing to do with the bad luck. It is not because he was running out of luck and he lost the battles. It is all because of what he has been doing, what he has been saying, and step by step he end up in the tragedy, in the losing of the battle. Let us take a look at verse 6. So Saul and his three sons died, and all his house died together. So just now we mentioned that in 1 Samuel chapter 30 and 31 are more or less the same with this passage. But here there's a little bit adjustment in this chapter. Because in chapter 31 it says that, so because of this, Saul and his three sons, as well as the armor bearers, as well as those people who follow him, as well as all those people who follow him, all of them were killed. But now in this chapter, the armor bearers as well as those people who followed him were cancelled, were deleted. But here instead it puts, the writer puts, his house died together. But the fact is that not his whole house died together, because Jonathan's descendants survived. But yet the author would like to emphasize that his whole house died, because what the author was intending to do was the failure of the dynasty of King Saul. So that's why the armor bearers, or maybe all those people who follow him, whether they die or not, is not the focus of First Chronicles, according to the author. And then what's the consequence? In verse 7, when all the men of Israel who were in the valley saw what they had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they forsook their cities and fled. Then the Philistines came and dwelt in them. Philistines were supposedly to live by the seaside. But yet, because they won the battle, so that's why they were living on the flat land, on the plateau. So actually, the flat land, the plateau, belongs to the Israelites. That was the promised land. So that was in the promised land. But yet, since the Israelites lost the battles, the Philistines just came in and dwelt in the promised land. How come it will end up like this? So actually we need to go back to the beginning, because at the start the Israelites asked for the king for themselves. So because of that, King Samuel was not happy. And then God comforted him. Okay, don't be too sorry. Don't be too sad. Actually, the Israelites did not look down on you. They just only looked down on me. So you just let them do whatever they wanted to do. God would like to set up a new king, but the leaders were not ready yet, and God's timing has not come yet. But yes, the Israelites would like to rush to set up a king for them, because for them they think that it's safer to have a king over them. And they also wanted to imitate the other nations, to get their own kings, to get their own military force, to get their own armies. So that's why they rushed into doing all these things. So that's why. But yet, in God's timing, God didn't think that it's the right time yet. Well, but for the Israelites, they all the way didn't realize the importance of God's timing, because they didn't realize that they needed protections of God, because at that time they were living in the promised land on the flatlands. But yet finally, because they lost the battles, and then the Philistines just came into the promised land and living there. So what does it tell us? That whatever man wants to do, if it is different from what God wants to do, finally they will end up in the tragedy. So in a nutshell, the Philistines live in the promised land on the flat land. So it means that the very first decision of setting up a king over Israel was a mistake. Also here, then we are told that King Saul died, and then his body was found. I should put it this way. So I should put it this way. Nothing was coincidence. Why would King Saul be killed in that way? Would died in that way? In verse 9. And they stripped him and took his head and his armor, and sent word throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their idols and among the people. Verse 9. So how to deal with his clothes, his armor? So in verse 10, then they put his armor in the temple of their gods and fastened his head in the temple of Dagon. The armor represented his identity, represented his position, his status, his face value. So since you always ask for your safe value, right? So finally your clothes, your armor were stripped, and instead all the armors were put in the temple of their gods. So when you treasure lots of your face value, finally you will lose your face values. King Saul was a king. So it means that he was the head of the nations. When his head was cut off, so it means that he was not a suitable candidate to be the head. So when his head was cut off, it means that all his thinking, his mentality got the issues. So that's why his head was cut off as a kind of judgment. And also his head was put in the temple of Dagon. And actually Dagon was an idol. So Dagon was the idol of harvest, was the agricultural kind of god. So people will worship Dagon for the very good agricultural harvest as well as success. So that's what King Saul had been thinking about. So it means that what King Saul had been thinking was in the realm of Dagon. So that's why even though King Saul was the king over Israelites, but yet his kind of thinking and mentality was more or less in line with what's Dagon, the idol. Of course, man would like to have success. Man would like to have good harvest. So that all this kind of thinking belongs to Dagon. So, and also his armor belonged to the temple of Ashtaroth. Because why? Because Ashtaroth was a kind of a warrior idol. Because Ashtaroth belongs to a kind of warrior idol. So that's why King Saul's armor was put in the temple for Ashtaroth. Because King Saul was a warrior somehow. And then his head was put in the temple of Dagon. So do you see that? When King Saul was alive, he treasured a lot of his face value. Even by the time he was about to die, he treasured a lot of his face value still. So you see, the kind of his death, the way the people deal with his body was a kind of humiliation to his face value. Today we need to learn to deal with our flesh and put our flesh to death. So you see, from the example of King Saul, we could see that his armor was stripped, his head was cut off. And in verse 11 and 12, we are told that when all Jabesh Gilead heard all that Philistines had done to Saul, because why? Because King Saul did save Jabesh Gilead. So that's why here we are told that Jabesh Gilead would like to gather the body of Saul and also fast and pray for him for 7 days. So that is the way that Jabesh Gilead trying to remember King Saul for what he had done for them. So this is the life of King Saul in this chapter. He did something good for Jabesh Gilead, so that's why in return Jabesh Gilead also did something nice for him for his body. So this is all about this King Saul. So the author of First Chronicles summarized the life of King Saul in 2 verses, in verse 13 and 14. So Saul died for his unfaithfulness which he had committed against the Lord, because he did not keep the word of the Lord, and also because he consulted a medium for guidance. And verse 14, but he did not inquire of the Lord. Therefore he killed him and turns the kingdom over to David, the son of Jesse. What we could see is that he lost the battle, but yet the presentation of the author was very detailed. It was very subtle, I should put it this way. So in verse 13, so Saul died, but in the original text, so Saul died of disobedience and rebellion. So it means that the root cause for his death was his disobedience and rebellion. Of course, speaking of rebellion, it can be the rebellion against God as well as man. So that's why the author was very particular in this part. So the root cause of his death was his disobedience and rebellion against God. So the author would like to emphasize the cause of his death was because of his disobedience. So that's why in verse 13 we are told that King Saul had committed against the Lord, and he had been unfaithful to the Lord. So that's why so this is a very simple concept because of his unfaithfulness to God, and he died. He died of his unfaithfulness as well as disobedience. And then the writer moved on to say that because King Saul did not keep the word of the Lord. And also because King Saul consulted a medium for guidance. So do you see that the reason was given one by one? And then finally in verse 14 that we are told that King Saul did not inquire of the Lord. So maybe especially in verse 14 when we look at it, we might be a bit confused. As a matter of fact, King Saul did inquire of the Lord, at least superficially, but yet God did not pay attention to him. So that's why finally he turned to the medium and consult the medium for guidance. So it might sound wrong for King Saul if you say that he did not inquire of the Lord, because he will say that God, actually I've been inquiring of you, but you never reply me. So please pay attention. It might be more or less our situation when it comes to our relationship with our authority. So you might also say that, hey, I've been inquiring of the Lord, but you never reply me. So this is all the problems of God. But God said that actually your way of asking me is not proper at all. What is your intention? I don't really think that when I speak to you, you will listen to me anyway. Because you do not inquire of me with the listening ears, with the heart ready to listen to my advice. So because of that, I did not reply you. And remember that David, once he became the king, he looked for the Ark of the Covenant. But yet for King Saul, he had been king for 40 years. So where was that Ark of Covenant? It seems that there's nothing to do with him. So that's why obviously it tells us that King Saul's heart was not in God. Over a lot of issues, King Saul did not really put his heart in God. Even Samuel rebuked him. He never repented before the Lord. So if you remember in a battle with King Agag, he spared Agag as well. He spared all the animals, all the cows and cattle, everything. But instead, he could say to God that, God, whatever you ask me to do, I had complied already. But what is happening is that it is only his partial obedience. So partial obedience is disobedience. He tried to be the master in whatever he wants to do. He didn't really got the desire to listen to God's instructions. So that's why finally God rejected him. God did not heed his request anymore. But in the eyes of King Saul, he thought that he had been inquiring of the Lord. But yet in God's perspective, he thought that King Saul, anyway, you did not have the intention to listen to my instruction anyway. So it's because of that, I couldn't be bothered to talk to you anymore. So that's why the author of First Chronicles have been trying to deliver the message at one level after another level. He died of unfaithfulness because of his being unfaithful to God. And also he did not listen to the word of God. So there are 3 levels. And also finally he consulted the medium for guidance. And then finally we are told that he did not inquire of the Lord. So it's all because of all these 5 issues, all these 5 reasons of the different level. That's why finally he ended in the tragedy. So in the perspective of the world of the man, people might think that, hey, King Saul, you've been king for many years. How come you could not manage to strengthen your army, to strengthen your military force? So the military force is something very important, but how come you fail to govern it, to manage it? This is what men think. But yet, in God's perspective, it's different. It's all because of his rebellion. So that's why finally King Saul ended up in the tragedy. So it means that King Saul did not ever had a genuine interaction with God. So that's why God allowed King Saul to be killed. And that's what God allowed to happen to King Saul. So that's why finally the kingdom belonged to David instead. So in a word, God, back then, for those people, for the Israelites, after the captivity, when they went back to Jerusalem, they still needed to keep following God. So, and the life of King Saul was a kind of warning to them, also a kind of warning to us as well in the current day. Well, we might think that it's not that difficult to do the evangelism, right? It's not difficult to share gospel with people. But yet when you come to talk about water baptism, some people might not want to do that. And so some of the people are gone. And then after the water baptism, you say that, oh, it's the time to join the cell group. Then there might be another group of people who don't want to join the cell group. So they choose to go. So when we talk about the go back to the original, to the starting point, what does it mean? It means that the people do not want to follow God wholeheartedly. So that's what happened to King Saul as well. Remember the life of King Saul? Actually, he came from a very large family, quite a well-to-do family, and the father asked him to look for the lost donkey. While he was looking for the donkey, and then he met Samuel. So once he met Samuel, and then finally he got the throne. So, all these things were not initiated by Saul himself. But yet remember that back then he might be the best candidate among the Israelites already. So that's why for the elders of the Israelites, they thought that he's the best candidate to become the king over Israel. So anyway, back then King Saul was the best candidate to become the king over Israel. So that's why today we need to all prepare ourselves. Don't ever think that the turn will not come to you. Don't ever think it that way. Unknowingly, your life has changed. In 611, maybe you would not be told about the commission even 1 week beforehand. Don't ever think that he will be commissioned, not me. I'm talking about all the commissioning of the leaders, because the leaders secured a certain position in God. So when a certain leader is commissioned, so it means that his position becomes vacant. So it means that some other people needs to come up to do the replacement of his position. Recently, in our branch churches, including us, there are more than 20 people who there was the special rearrangement for them. I believe that all these people never thought that they would be, their position would be rearranged. So it's the same for King Saul as well. He could never imagine that he would be anointed as a king at the very beginning. So that's why for us, don't ever think that it would not happen to us either. So the turn will come to us one day. Well, since all the way you've been very serious about morning devotion, since you've been very serious about following God, since all the way you've been very serious about serving God and all these things, right? Then definitely the turn will go to you one day, and God will choose you one day. So just think about it. How many people, how many Christians in Hong Kong will get up so early to go into the church to listen to the morning devotion? Not many, right? But today, every one of you are sitting here for the morning devotion. So I believe that the turn will go to you one day. Don't ever think that this is something very, very distant, very remote. It will never happen to you. Don't think in that way. For King Saul, he's been spending his 40 years as a king to come up with this kind of so-called life testimony. And then the author of First Chronicles puts his tragic life end into the book of First Chronicles as a kind of warning to the people of generations. So that's why we need to be careful. Don't ever rebel against God. We need to keep following God because God has been with us all the time. But don't be worried. Don't ever think that once you make the mistake, then the consequence would be very horrible. No, that would not be the case. But because God really treasures our lives, but it's different for King Saul because step by step, he's been staying away from God, being unrepentant. So that's why finally he ended up in the tragic end. So for us, What matters is that we need to be repentant all the times. Don't ever be stubborn. We have to understand that God loves us all the times. So if we do not stay faithful to God, who else can we stay faithful? So when the Ark of Covenant was put in the temple of Dagon, and in the statue, the statue of the idol of Dagon was even broken into pieces. So that's why today we need to keep following God. Let us come up and worship God together.